The galaxy discovered human war tactics and immediately banned them. The first thing the council asked me was whether I felt any regret. I was standing in the center of a room, so large that the far wall was a blur of pale light and alien faces, 60 counselors arranged in a half circle above me like a court of gods who had already decided the verdict. My boots were clean, my uniform was pressed. I had prepared for this moment for 3 weeks, rehearsing answers in the mirror of my bunk aboard the transport ship while the stars drifted past the porthole. I had answers ready for almost every question. I had not prepared for that one. My name is Yara Solis. I am 34 years old. I grew up in a small town in northern England, and before all of this, I was a logistics officer who had never fired a weapon in actual combat. Now I was standing before the Galactic Compact's Emergency War Ethics Tribunal on Veth Station, 500 light-years from home, being asked if I felt regret about ending a war. I said yes because it was true. I just was not sure I regretted what they thought I regretted. The tribunal had been convened 11 days after the ceasefire with the Kaith Dominion. The Kaith had launched an unprovoked offensive against 3 human settled systems 8 months prior. What snorts followed was a conflict the Compact had expected to last decades. The Kaith were older, larger, and far more experienced at war than we were. They had ships that made ours look like toys. They had warriors who had been fighting before humanity had invented the wheel. They surrendered in 11 weeks. The Compact did not know what to make of that, so they called me in to explain it, because I had been the one coordinating operations from the Joint Command Center on Callaway Base, and because my name appeared on more documents than anyone else's. I was not a general. I was not a hero. I was a woman who was very good at reading spreadsheets and understanding what the numbers meant. It turned out that skill was worth more than anyone expected. The presiding elder's name was unpronounceable to human tongue, so the translation unit rendered it as Vale. Vale was tall and pale and ancient-looking, with 4 eyes arranged in a vertical line and fingers so long they curled twice before they ended. Vale spoke in a voice that the translation unit softened, but I could still feel the original vibration of it in my chest. Commander Solis, Vale said, the Compact has reviewed the operational records you submitted. We have questions. I understand, I said. We will begin with the matter of resource interdiction. I nodded. Resource interdiction, that was the polite term we used internally. What it meant in practice was that my team had mapped every supply line the Kaith were using and then systematically made those supply lines unusable, not by engaging their ships directly, by making the routes themselves dangerous mines in certain corridors, false sensor ghosts that made ships reroute into longer paths, quiet deals with neutral stations to delay refueling agreements. By the 6th week of the conflict, the Kaith forward fleets were operating on reduced fuel, reduced ammunition, and reduced food supplies. Their fighters were hungry and tired before they ever engaged ours. I explained all of this to the council, calmly and clearly, the way I would explain a logistics report to my commanding officer. The silence that followed was not comfortable. One of the counselors, a species I recognized as the Thin, who communicated through color changes in their outer Membrane had shifted entirely to a pale, washed-out gray. I had learned enough about thin communication to know that gray meant something close to dread. You disrupted their supply chains. Vale said, not their military assets. Their supply chains. Yes, I said, it is more efficient. Another silence, longer this time. Please continue, Vale said in a tone that suggested they were not sure they wanted me to. So I continued. I explained the misinformation operations, how my colleague Drew Nolan had led a small team that fed false intelligence to Keith Command, convincing them that our primary offensive would come from the eastern approach when we were actually massing forces on the western corridor. The Keith had repositioned 2 full fleets to guard against an attack that never came. By the time they realized the error, our actual advance was already 3 days ahead of schedule. I explained how we had used the terrain of the Barath Nebula, which the Keith considered impassable, to move a significant portion of our fleet to a position directly behind their main command vessel. The Keith had a concept of honorable engagement that required advance notification of an offensive. We had not provided advance notification. We had appeared seemingly from nowhere, in a position that made resistance pointless. I noticed the counselors were no longer taking notes. I explained the psychological aspect of our communication strategy, how every message we sent to Keith Command was carefully constructed, not just to convey information, but to create a particular emotional state in the reader. Uncertainty, isolation, the sense that their allies were less reliable than they had believed. It was not lies. Exactly, it was the careful selection of truths arranged in a specific order. The thin counselor had turned a color I had no reference for. Vale raised one of those long, doubled hands. Commander Solis, Vale said, I must stop you. I stopped. Are you aware, Vale said slowly, that of the 11 tactics you have described in the past 40 minutes, 9 of them are listed in the Compact's Armistice Accords as prohibited methods of conflict? I blinked. I was not aware of that, no. Are you aware that those prohibitions have been in force for 300 years? We are a recent member of the Compact. I said carefully. Our onboarding documentation was extensive, but I cannot claim to have read every article of every accord. Vale looked at me for a long time. Around the chamber, 60 faces, membranes, clusters of sensory organs, and visual receptors were all pointed at me with the same expression. I had seen that expression before. I had seen it on the face of my younger brother when he was 10 years old, and I had explained to him, without drama or embellishment, exactly how a slaughterhouse worked. He had looked at me exactly like this. Commander Solis, Vale said, you must understand something. Nothing you have described to us today is new. All of it was practiced before. All of it was studied, documented, and ultimately banned by this compact 300 years ago. I said nothing. We banned it, Vale continued, because the species that invented these methods used them so thoroughly and so effectively that they could not stop. They turned every technique you have described upon their own neighbors, their own populations, within 40 years of their ascension to interstellar capability. They were gone. Vale paused. We thought the knowledge had died with them. The room was very quiet. We were wrong, Vale said. It appears humanity invented all of it again. independently, without a teacher. I stood there in the center of that enormous room under 60 pairs of alien eyes, and I understood for the first time why I had really been called here. This was not a debrief. It was not even a trial in the traditional sense. It was an assessment. They were trying to decide what we were. And from the look on Vale's face, they were not yet sure the answer was something they could live with. I think, Vale said quietly, that before we continue, you should see something. The archive was not on the station's official map. This did not surprise me. What surprised me was the size of it. I had imagined a room, perhaps a small hall. What I found following Vale and two silent, compact security officers down a long corridor that required 3 separate identity scans to navigate was a space that felt closer to an underground city. The ceilings were far above my head. The shelves, if you could call them that, because they were more like structured fields of light holding data. Arrays in suspension stretched in every direction further than I could clearly see. It was cold in there, deliberately cold. The kind of cold that says, whatever is stored here is too important to risk. Vale walked beside me without speaking. The security officer stayed 2 steps behind. My boots made the only sound on the floor, a soft, steady rhythm that echoed off surfaces I could not identify. We call it the Armistice Archive, Vale said when we reached a section marked with a symbol, my translation unit, rendered as something between quarantine and memory. It holds the complete documented record of every form of conflict that the Compact has formally prohibited. The methods, the counters, the historical outcomes, everything. And you keep it locked, I said. We keep it sealed, Vale said. The distinction seemed important to them. It is not hidden. Every senior Compact official knows it exists, but access is restricted to researchers with specific clearance, and the clearance is rarely granted. Vale looked at the suspended arrays around us. The logic was simple. If no one can read it, no one can use it. That logic assumes no one would reinvent it, I said. Vale did not answer that. Instead, they stopped in front of a particular section and gestured toward one of the light arrays. A display surface materialized at eye level, and what appeared on it was a catalog. I scanned down the entries. Logistics disruption through infrastructure denial, psychological operations targeting, command decision-making, intelligence fabrication and strategic misdirection, terrain exploitation beyond declared engagement zones, resource attrition as a primary offensive strategy. I read the list twice, then I said, "These are my reports." "They are not," Vale said. "Those records are 300 years old. The terminology is different, the scale is different, but the underlying methods are identical." I looked at the catalog for a long moment. What species made these? Vale's expression shifted into something that was hard to read. We call them the Vorath. They no longer exist. The archivist was waiting for us. Little further in, a Compact official named Kelmot. Kelmot was one of the Suring, a species that resembled to a human eye something between a very tall person and a willow tree in early spring. They moved fluidly, and they blinked rarely, and when they looked at me as I approached, I could see very clearly that they were afraid. Not of me personally, perhaps, but of what I represented. Kelmot gave a formal greeting and then proceeded to explain in careful and measured language what had happened to the Voreth. They had been, by all accounts, a remarkable species, brilliant engineers, sophisticated thinkers, passionate about the concept of civilization. They had developed interstellar travel approximately 4 centuries ago and had expanded quickly, making contact with several species in their region. They were not aggressive by nature, but they were competitive, and they were extraordinarily good at conflict when conflict became necessary. The methods began as tools of survival. They faced an early threat from a larger, stronger neighbor, and in order to survive, they developed every unconventional advantage they could find: deception, misdirection, patience. They won that conflict, and then they faced another threat, and they used the same tools, and they won that one too. The problem, Kelmot explained, was that the tools became a habit, not of the species as a whole, but of the institutions the species built, the military planners who had succeeded using these methods continued to use them because they worked. The politicians who had benefited from the information advantages continued to demand them. Gradually, the methods spread from external conflicts to internal ones. Factions within Voreth society began using the same techniques against each other: resource denial, manufactured uncertainty, the careful arrangement of partial truths. Within a generation, Kelmot said, had applied every technique they had developed for external conflict to themselves. They did not collapse from a single catastrophic event. They eroded slowly from the inside. I was quiet for a moment, then I said, "What happened at the end?" Kelmot looked at me carefully. At the end, the species they had once struggled to survive, the neighbor they had defeated using these very methods, was still there. They had watched what happened to the Voreth, and when the Voreth were too weakened to resist, that neighbor finished what had begun. It was a story about a weapon that had turned around in the hand of the one who built it. I stood among 300 years of classified records and let that sink in. The compact prohibited the methods. After the Voreth extinction, Vale said, speaking again from beside me, logic was that if one species could be destroyed by these tactics, others could be too. The prohibition was meant to protect everyone by keeping everyone equally uninformed. I said. Neither Vale nor Kelmot responded to that. I walked further into the archive. I stopped in front of an exhibit that held a physical artifact, a thin sheet of something like metal covered in symbols that my translation unit struggled with. It was labeled as a fragment of a Voreth strategic planning document. The translation came through in pieces: resource allocation, population, resilience, the cost of continuation. It was a document about whether to keep fighting, about whether the price of resistance was worth it. The Snorts Voreth planner who had written it had concluded, not yet, keep the pressure exactly where it is. I recognized the thinking. I had written documents that sounded very much like this. I turned to look at Kelmot. They were still watching me from several steps back, that careful, measured fear still present in their posture. "You are afraid of us," I said, not as an accusation, just as an observation. "I am afraid of what you know," Kelmot said, "and I am afraid of what it might mean that you know it." "The Voreth knew it too," I said, "and They did not survive it. Is that what you are thinking? It is what the council is discussing. Kelmot said quietly, yes. I looked around the archive, this vast, cold, sealed room full of knowledge that the Compact had decided was too dangerous to share and too important to destroy. It had occurred to me from the moment I first heard about the Vorath that the Compact's logic had a significant flaw. Hiding the knowledge had not stopped humanity from finding it. We had found all of it on our own through trial and error and centuries of conflict with each other on a single small planet at the edge of a quiet galaxy. We had developed these methods and we had used them against ourselves exactly as the Vorath had. We had done it for centuries. We had done it at scale. We had done it with weapons that made the Vorath's capabilities look modest. And we were still here. I did not say this out loud, not yet. I was beginning to understand that the timing of what I said mattered as much as what I said. That was itself a lesson from the archive. But I filed it away carefully for later. When does the council vote? I asked. Vale and Kelmot exchanged a look. 72 hours, Vale said. I nodded. Then I have some reading to do. The room they gave me was small and clean and slightly too warm for my comfort, which suggested it had been calibrated for a species that ran cooler than humans. I did not complain. I set my tablet on the desk, connected it to the public-facing portion of the Compact's legal database, which was extensive, and began to read. The vote was going to be on a motion proposed by a Compact faction I had come to think of as the isolationists, though their official designation was longer and more diplomatic. The motion was straightforward: classify humanity as a Compact security risk, restrict our movement between systems, and place our military capabilities under Compact oversight pending a full review. The review had no defined endpoint. In practical terms, it meant quarantine, not as punishment, as containment. Drew Nolan arrived on the second evening. I heard his knock before I heard the door signal, which was typical of him. Drew was a man who believed in knocking even when technology rendered it unnecessary, because, as he once told me, it gave people a moment to compose themselves. He was my age, from a small city in Southern Ireland, and he had the quality of looking slightly rumpled regardless of how recently he had pressed his clothes. He brought 2 cups of actual coffee, which on a space station was either a small miracle or evidence of significant bribery. I took the coffee without asking how he had obtained it. Bad? He asked. Complicated, I said. He sat down across from me and looked at the tablet screen, which was currently displaying 300 years of Compact conflict. Long. He was quiet for a moment in that way of his, the particular silence that meant he was organizing his thoughts rather than having no thoughts. The ambassador wants to talk to you, he said. The ambassador was a man named Oliver Farr, Earth's senior diplomatic representative to the Compact. Oliver Farr was 61 years old, had spent 30 years in interstellar diplomacy, and had the particular quality of being consistently pleasant in a way that made it very difficult to know what he actually thought about anything. When I said, "Tonight, if possible," what does he want? Drew looked at his coffee. He said he wants to offer support, but he specifically asked me to tell you that he is also carrying a message from Earth Command. I set down my cup. Earth Command, I said slowly, wants to offer support. They want to offer a particular kind of support, Drew said, the kind where we lose the vote. I stared at him. They think, Drew said carefully, that being placed under compact oversight, officially, formally, on record, gives us something. It gives us a seat at the table inside the compact security infrastructure. It makes us accountable to their systems, which means we are inside their systems. They want us to lose, I said, because losing puts us inside the organization that runs everything. That is the argument, Drew said. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling, which was a pale, slightly iridescent material that the compact used extensively in stations like this. It caught the light in a way that was almost calming. That, I said, is exactly the kind of thinking that got us brought here in the first place. Drew said nothing. He was very good at saying nothing in a way that communicated agreement. I picked up my coffee again. I looked at the legal database on my tablet, and then I looked at Drew, who was watching me with the expression of someone who already knew what I was going to say, but was politely waiting for me to say it. I am going to win this, I said. I thought so, he said. And then Earth Command is going to be very unhappy with me. Also, yes, he said. Good, I said, and turned back to the tablet and went to work. The database was large but not disorganized. The compact was meticulous about its records in a way that humanity was still learning to be. I searched for three things simultaneously. The first was the specific legal text of every article in the Armistice Accords that covered prohibited conflict methods. The second was the complete case history of every species that had been classified as a security risk and what had happened to them subsequently. The third was something the archivist had mentioned in passing, almost as an aside, that I had not let go of. Every band tactic has a counter. Kelmot had said it almost absently while explaining the archive structure. The archive did not store the prohibited methods in isolation, it stored them with their documented responses, counterintelligence methods, negotiation frameworks, the systems that had been developed over centuries to address, limit, or redirect each form of prohibited conflict. I spent the first 6 hours building a picture of the species that had been classified as security risks had almost, without exception, fared badly. The compact's oversight systems were thorough and long-lasting. Several were still under review generations later. The classification was effectively permanent because the review process required unanimous council approval to reverse, and unanimous approval of 60 diverse species was essentially impossible on any contested topic. That was the trap Oliver Farr and Earth Command were willing to walk into. Once we were inside for good. I spent the next 6 hours with the counter-tactics section of the archives, documented history, reading through framework after framework that the compact had developed over 3 centuries to address prohibited methods. They were comprehensive. They were also exclusively defensive. Every single one of them was designed to protect a species or a system from being targeted by these tactics. None of them were designed to teach the species how to stop using the tactics themselves. That was the gap. That was the thing nobody had addressed in 300 years of prohibition. I made notes. My handwriting was poor. Always had been, so I made them in the tablet's voice detect system, speaking quietly in the warm small room in the middle of the station's night cycle, while Drew slept on the narrow secondary cot in the corner. By the time the station's lighting shifted to indicate morning, I had the shape of an argument. It was not the argument I had prepared on the transport ship. It was not the careful legal case I had outlined in the mirror of my bunk. It was something else, something that had only become possible because of what I had seen in the archive. I sent a brief message to Oliver Farr, telling him I would not need his guidance. His response was polite and brief and said, in diplomatic language, that he hoped I understood what I was doing. I sent a message to Vale asking for confirmation of my speaking time at the tribunal. Then I stood up, stretched, and looked out the porthole of my small room at the slow turning of the stars outside Veth Station. Somewhere out there was a system Keth had held 2 months ago that was now resettling with human families. Somewhere out there was Callaway Base, where the operations center I had run looked probably exactly the same as when I had left it, because operations centers always look the same whether you have just won or lost. Somewhere very far behind me was Earth, my small town in northern England, the particular gray color of autumn skies there, and the smell of damp leaves, and the unremarkable ordinary peace of a place that had been at war many times in its history and had somehow always produced people who chose to rebuild. Afterward, I thought about that, about choosing to rebuild. I thought about the Vorith who had apparently never found their way to that. Joyce. Drew stirred on the cot behind me. It is morning, he said without opening his eyes. It is, I said. Are we ready? I turned from the porthole. My notes were on the tablet. My argument was formed. My hands were steady, though I was aware of a vibration somewhere in my chest that was not quite fear and not quite excitement, but something in between that I had no better word for. Yes, I said, let us go. The council chamber felt different the second time. When I had first stood in the center of that enormous half-circle 2 days ago, I had been a subject of inquiry. Clear's throat a witness. I had answered questions and watched the reactions and tried to calibrate what I did not yet fully understand. I had not known, walking in that first time, what I was walking into. I knew now. The 60 counselors were arranged exactly as before. Vale presided from the central elevated position, those 4 eyes arranged in that vertical line, that long-fingered presence that managed to feel both ancient and very present. Kelmont was there too, in a seat to the side that was designated for advisors to the tribunal. Kelmont's posture was careful in a way that told me they were aware this would matter. Oliver Farr was in the observer gallery. I did not look at him. Drew was seated behind the low barrier at the back of the chamber floor. He gave me a small nod as I walked past. I did not nod back because I was concentrating on the floor in front of me, on the pace of my own footsteps, on keeping the vibration in my chest at a manageable level. I reached the center of the chamber. I stopped. I waited. Commander Solis, Vale said, you have been granted speaking time of 30 minutes to address the tribunal before the vote is called. You may begin. I had prepared an opening 3 sentences, clean and clear, that would orient the council to the structure of my argument. I had rehearsed them. They were good sentences. I did not say them because Vale, right before indicating I could begin, had said something small, something almost incidental, the way that the most important things often are. Before you begin, Vale had said, the council wishes you to know that new information has come to light overnight regarding the Vorath extinction. The historical record is more complex than previously presented. We considered delaying the vote, but the majority felt it more appropriate to proceed. You may be aware of this information. You may not be. Either way, the vote will proceed as scheduled. I stood in the center of the chamber and recalibrated everything in approximately 4 seconds. New information about the Vorath extinction. The historical record is more complex. I looked at Vale. May I ask what information? Vale paused. This was not expected. Apparently, the speaking time was meant to be unidirectional, but after a moment, Vale said, the Vorlag did not become extinct as a result of internal erosion alone. The final collapse was accelerated by an external actor, a species that had been observing the Vorlag's decline and chose to act while the moment was available. Vale paused. Again, that species is still a member of this compact. The chamber was completely silent. I let that silence hold for a moment. Then I said, so the Vorlag were not solely responsible for their own ending. That is a matter of ongoing discussion, Vale said carefully. But the prohibition on their methods was created using their story, the whole story, which was not complete. Vale did not answer. I looked around the chamber, 60 faces, 60 different kinds of eyes and sensors, and perception, 60 species that had agreed 300 years ago to a set of rules based on what they believed had happened, and at least one of them in this room had known the full story and chosen to leave part of it out. I did not know which one. That was fine. I did not need to know. I had planned to argue. I said that humanity should not be classified as a security risk because we are capable of restraint. I was going to show you documents, treaties, international courts, the systems we built over centuries to contain our own tendencies. I paused. I am still going to make that argument, but I want to address something first. I turned slowly, taking in the full semicircle. The prohibition you created 300 years ago was based on a story about a species that used these methods and was destroyed. The lesson you drew was that the methods themselves were the danger. So you banned them, you put them in a locked room and told yourselves that if no one could read them, no one could use them. I let that sit. Humanity never read them. We were not there 300 years ago. We found all of these methods on our own on a single planet through our own history, and we used them on ourselves, on our neighbors, for centuries at a scale that would make what I described about the Keth conflict look very small indeed. I could hear the chamber adjusting around me, the subtle sounds of 60 different species shifting in their seats. The Vorlag used these methods and they are gone. Humanity used these methods and we are here. I want you to think about what the difference is, because it is not the methods. The methods are the same. We invented the same tools independently. The difference is Something else. I reached into my jacket and took out my tablet. On it was a document I had spent 2 hours translating with the station's legal database and a great deal of patience. I held it up. This is the Geneva Conventions, I said. It is a document from Earth's history. It is approximately 300 years old, which I find interesting. At the time it was written, humanity had just completed the most destructive conflict in our recorded history. We had used every prohibited method in your archive and many others, and we had done so on a scale that reshaped entire civilization. I lowered the tablet, and then in the aftermath of that, we wrote rules, not because we had stopped being capable of those methods, not because we had forgotten them. And GT snorts. And GT, we wrote rules because we had lived through the consequences, and we decided that some things should not be done even when they could be done, even when doing them would give an advantage. I looked at Vale. The Vorlag developed these methods and could not stop using them, and you looked at that and concluded the methods were the problem. But I want to suggest something different. I want to suggest that the Vorlag never developed what we developed alongside those methods, which is the institutional capacity to choose not to use them. The thin counselor had shifted color. Again, this time it was not gray, it was something warmer. Your archive holds every prohibited method in complete detail. It also holds every counter method, but what it does not hold, what has never been compiled in 300 years, is a framework for teaching species how to develop the internal restraint to make the counters unnecessary. I took a breath. Classify us as a security risk, and you put us in a system that manages our behavior from the outside. It might work. It also might produce exactly the resentment and institutional pressure that drives a species to use every tool available to resist external control. I paused. I have read your historical records on species that were classified. Several of them confirmed this pattern. The chamber was very still. Or I said, you do not classify us. You accept that the knowledge exists and cannot be unlearned, and you use us, our history, our experience, our 300-year-old document about the rules of conflict to build the framework that your archive has always been missing. I stopped talking. The silence lasted longer than I expected. It was the kind of silence that is doing work, that is carrying something from one place to another. I stood in the center of it and kept my breathing even. Vale spoke. You are proposing that humanity become a resource rather than a subject of this tribunal. I am proposing that we are already a resource, I said. The only question is whether you use us or contain us. The vote was called 40 minutes later, after a closed consultation among the counselors that I was not part of. I sat in an anteroom with Drew and a cup of water that was slightly the wrong temperature and waited. When I was called back in, Vale announced the result, 11-9, in our favor. I stood very still when I heard it. The vibration in my chest, which had been present since I walked into the chamber, did not go away, but it changed quality. It became something different, something that felt from the inside like the particular kind of tired that follows the kind of effort where everything was committed and nothing was held back. Drew, from the back of the chamber, let out a breath that I could hear clearly across the quiet room. The counselor who had changed their vote and made the margin was Kelmot. The archivist, the Sarin official who had looked at me with careful fear in a cold archive full of things that were supposed to stay hidden. I would not find that out until later. But when I did, I thought about it for a long time. The docking bay on Veth Station had a view of open space through a long curved transparency. It was early by the station's clock and the light was dim and indirect, the kind of light that is present without committing to anything. My transport was being prepared too. Levels below. Drew had gone ahead to ensure our equipment was correctly logged. He was the kind of person who needed to see this done himself or he would worry about it the entire journey home. I was standing at the transparency, looking at the stars when I heard footsteps behind me, careful footsteps. The particular gait of a Sarin trying to be quiet on a hard floor. Commander Solis, Kelmot said. I turned. Kelmot was in their official archivist uniform, and they were carrying in one of those fluid, many-jointed hands, a small flat case that I recognized as a data storage object. I wanted to speak with you, Kelmot said, before you left. I am glad you did, I said. Kelmot was quiet for a moment in the way that suggested they had planned what to say and were now reconsidering the order of it. When you were in the archive, Kelmot said finally, and I told you I was afraid of what you knew, I was being truthful. I was afraid. I had spent 16 years as the archivist of those records, and in that time I had come to believe genuinely that the prohibition was the right response, that the correct lesson from the Vorlag was that some knowledge was too dangerous to carry. And now, I said. Now, Kelmot said slowly, I believe I was thinking about the wrong question. I was asking whether the knowledge was safe. I should have been asking whether the prohibition was working. I said nothing. I let them continue. It was not working, Kelmot said. 300 years and the first species we encounter who was not part of the compact at the time of the prohibition had reinvented everything independently. The knowledge could not be contained. It never could have been. We were protecting ourselves from a danger that was not actually in the archive. The archive was just the record of it. The danger was in us, I said. The capacity was in all of us, Kelmot said with a precision that I appreciated. The capacity for the methods and the capacity for the restraint. Your species developed both. The Vorlag developed only one. We nearly went the same way as the Vorlag, I said. Several times. We are not a success story with a clean ending. We are a species that keeps making the same choices badly and then surviving the consequences and trying again. Yes, Kelmot said, but you try again. That is the part that was missing from the Vorlag record. They extended the small flat case toward me. This is a copy of the full archive. Index, Kelmot said. Not the restricted content, the catalog, a complete list of everything the archive holds, including the counter frameworks. It is technically within the scope of public compact documentation, though it has never been distributed widely. A pause. I thought it might be useful for the Joint Commission. I took the case. It was lighter than I expected. The Joint Commission does not officially exist yet, I said. No, Kelmot said, but it will. I looked at them for a moment. You changed your vote. Kelmot was quiet. You do not have to confirm it, I said. I am not going to tell anyone. I just want you to know that I know and that I am grateful. Kelmot looked out at the stars beyond. The transparency. Their membrane in the indirect early light was a soft and indeterminate color that my very limited understanding of Suring expression could not parse precisely, but it did not look like fear. It looked like something more deliberate than that. I changed my vote, Kelmot said, because you walked into my archive and you were not afraid of what was in it. Every scholar who has ever been given access to those records walks in. Carefully, they touch things gently. They read with the distance of someone who does not want to be changed by what they are reading. A pause. You walked in and recognized it the way you recognize something from home. I thought about northern England. Gray, autumn skies, damp leaves, the particular quiet of a place that has seen enough history to have earned its quiet. It is from home, I said. Yes, Kelmot said, and that was what frightened me most at first, and then it was what reassured me. They turned from the transparency to look at me directly. A species that carries this knowledge as part of its history, not as a weapon, not as a secret, but as something it has lived through and chosen to limit, is not the Vorlag. It is something different, something the compact has not encountered before. My transport notification came through on my communicator. 2 minutes. I tucked the data case under my arm. I offered Kelmot my hand, the human gesture, and after only a brief moment of consideration, they took it. Their long fingers wrapping around mine in something that was not quite a human handshake, but was a genuine attempt at one. I will be in contact, I said, about the commission. I will be in the archive, Kelmot said. As always. I walked to the elevator. Drew was already there, looking slightly anxious in the way he got when transport schedules were involved, his coat slightly more rumpled than when I had last seen him. I handed him the data case without explanation, and he looked at it and then at me and filed it away in his bag with the careful efficiency of someone who had worked with me long enough to know that explanations would follow when they could. The transport lifted away from Veth Station 40 minutes later. I took the window seat, Drew took the aisle, and for a long time neither of us said anything. The station fell away behind us. The stars ahead were steady and still, the way stars always are from a distance, giving no indication of the particular storms and silences happening around each of them. Somewhere in my bag was a copy of a document I had submitted formally to the compact archive before boarding. Contribution, as they had requested, from humanity, a record to sit alongside 300 years of classified methods and counter methods in the cold sealed vault, where knowledge went when the galaxy decided it was too important to share, but too dangerous to destroy. I had submitted the Geneva Conventions, the complete text, all 4 of them, with the additional protocols, no commentary, no covering note explaining the context, or the history or the significance, just the text itself, the way a thing should be offered when you trust the reader to understand it. The file name I had given it was simple, plain, the kind of title that a logistics officer with poor handwriting and a background in spreadsheets would choose for a document she wanted to be found and read rather than filed away and forgotten. It said what we chose. Months later, when we were 2 weeks from Earth and I was somewhere between asleep and awake in the narrow bunk of the transport cabin, my communicator lit up with a message from a Veth station. Address I recognized. It was from Kelmot. The message was brief. It said that the archive had begun a new project. That a translation initiative had been launched, the first in the archive's history, to render certain key documents into all 47 languages of compact member species. Priority had been given to the human submission. The working title of the translation project, Kelmot wrote, was a phrase from the Suring language that did not translate perfectly into English. The closest rendering was the ones who stayed. I read it twice, then I turned the communicator off and lay in the dark and listened to the quiet sound of the ship moving through space, taking me home. I thought about my small town in the north of England, about the autumn light and the smell of leaves, about every generation of my species that had built something and then at some point or another helped take it apart and then inevitably somehow built again. We had never been the best version of ourselves. We had never been the worst version of the Vorlag either, not quite. Though there had been moments that came close, we existed in the space between those two things, trying to move in the right direction more often than not. That was not a heroic story. It was not a triumphant one, not cleanly. It was just a true one. And out here, 500 light years from home, in a galaxy full of species who had been watching us from a careful distance, trying to decide what we were, it turned out that was exactly the kind of story worth reading. I closed my eyes. The ship kept moving. Somewhere in the forward cargo hold, a flat data case held a catalog of everything the galaxy had decided was too dangerous to remember. We would remember it together now. That was the point. That had always been the point.